go. So thanks very much, and thanks very much for the invite for this and for organising all of this lecture series, which has been so interesting so far. So my talk is conceptual engineering and the concept of evil. This is the outline of what I'm going to talk about. So I will first of all just say something about concepts and what notion of concept I have in mind, and also what conceptual engineering is, broadly speaking. Then I'll talk about the secular concept of evil, which has really come down to a debate between so-called evil skeptics and evil revivalists. And I will mention the evil skeptics argument, and then the evil revivalist, say something about the evil revivalists' rejoinder. Then I will talk about the way in which I think evil revivalism should be best understood, which is in something which I call the thin moral concept of evil. And then I will say something about how conceptual engineering would work with that thin moral concept of evil, and how we should think of the concept of evil and what we would want from it as well. So that's the general outline of the talk. So I will start off by talking about concepts and conceptual engineering, just so that we know where we stand. So a recent article by Sarah Sawyer distinguishes three different accounts of what concepts are. So it's quite easy to get misled in this area. And I think actually the broadest distinction would be between psychological accounts and the other two accounts, which some way I think have some crossover. But psychological accounts are what are sometimes known as conceptions rather than concepts. So that is, psychological account of concepts would be one in which you're thinking about a particular individual and you're talking about the way in which they personally understand the concept. So that is the kind of descriptions or the kind of connotations which they might have with a word. So just to take an example, if you've got two people talking about Aristotle, on the psychological account, they might have very different concepts of Aristotle. One of them might be a philosopher and they might know all of Aristotle's writings, and the other might know nothing about philosophy, might have just vaguely heard the name and had all kinds of confused ideas about who Aristotle was. So on the psychological account, you might have two individuals who have very, very different concepts. On the other two, I think concepts are understood in a much more social way. So they're understood and attached to linguistic tokens, for example. So semantic accounts would understand concepts in terms of their social identity, which is determined by use, and representational accounts would understand concepts in terms of how they're related to the world. So, for example, this is kind of account which goes back to people like Kripke and Putnam on this notion of a concept. A concept is so the concept of Aristotle, for example, is a concept which, in some sense, has a causal history.
Mike, I'm so sorry. I just muted you for a second.
That's all right.
I did not be the person. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So yeah, okay. So yeah. So on this account, it's representational accounts. Concepts are kind of socially determined, but also related to the world. So if you've got two people talking about Aristotle, even though they might have different conceptions, that is, different psychological understandings of who Aristotle is, they're still talking about the same person because their token of the concept Aristotle is traceable back to the person himself. So I'm going to really be thinking primarily in terms of B, maybe in terms of C a little bit, but I'll be primarily thinking of that more social aspect of a concept and not so much on the psychological notion of a concept. Okay, so conceptual engineering has come to the forefront of discussion of philosophical methodology since Herman Cappelen's Fixing Language, an essay on conceptual engineering. The aim of conceptual engineering is not just to analyze our existing concepts, which is one thing which traditionally people thought was the philosopher's role, but to evaluate them and to improve on them. So David Chalmers describes conceptual engineering as the design, evaluation, and implementation of concepts, where this might be the creation of new concepts de novo, as he puts it, or the re-engineering of previous concepts, or even, I mentioned this, the elimination of concepts, thinking concepts, certain concepts are not effective and should be eliminated from our language. So various concepts which have come up within the conceptual engineering literature would be things such as truth, concept of a woman, concept of race, the concept of belief, the concept of knowledge, concept of consciousness. And you might have different approaches to what you do when you evaluate a concept. You might decide, when you've looked at that concept and evaluated it, whether to retain the concept, for example, Davidson on truth, or re-engineer the concept, Sally Haslinger on woman, eliminate the concept, such as the Churchlands, Patricia and Paul Churchland on belief. They think we should eliminate the concept of belief, or maybe even duplicate a concept, such as Ned Block on consciousness, who thinks we can split the concept of consciousness into two. So my question in this talk is really about the concept of evil. So with the concept of evil, should we be retaining the concept which we've got? Should we be re-engineering the concept? Perhaps it should be eliminated, or perhaps it should be duplicated. We should think about different things which we're thinking about when we talk about evil. My broad claim would be to say that we can, if we think of evil as a thin concept, we can retain the concept, but we would need to re-engineer some of our conceptions and maybe re-engineer some of the thicker moral concepts which come attached to the concept of evil. So the process of conceptual engineering, when it applies to this concept of evil, is how should we evaluate that concept? And drawing on Sally Haslinger's questions about the concept of knowledge, we can ask, what is our current concept of evil? What, if anything, does the concept pick out or track? What is the point of having the concept of evil? What concept, if any, would do that work best? What concept would play that role the best? And as Haslinger says, these different sorts of projects cannot be kept entirely distinct, but draw upon different methodological strategies. So that's going to be part of what I'm going to talk about in this talk. What is our current concept of evil? What does it pick out? And what is the point of having a concept of evil? Is there a point in having it? Should we retain it? Should we re-engineer it? Should we have another concept which does a similar role, but plays it slightly different? Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about the concept of evil and about how it's come up within recent discussion within philosophy. So the concept has a deep history stretching back into antiquity. Andrew Schignell describes the concept as primordial. He says in a really interesting book, Evil, a History, which has a collection of articles about evil throughout history. He says in his introduction to that, depictions of a malevolent power or dark force that stands against the good and engenders chaos, suffering, and ruin are found in almost every literary, cultural, and religious tradition. And that's going to be partly important for what I say in what comes, because in discussing the concept of evil and thinking about all the different ways in which it's been applied through cultures and through history, what is that strand which makes that concept the same concept? across cultures and across time? Is there anything which makes that concept the same concept? I'm going to suggest there is. According to Susan Nyman, and this is a definition which I think is quite useful, and it's going to be something I'm going to partially lean upon. And I think it was also kind of way of thinking about evil, which Yujin Nagasawa brought up in his talk a couple of weeks ago, is to think of evil as being synonymous with some form of negative disruption of the ordinary, everyday patterns of life. That in some ways, evil is something which really disrupts the way in which we're living, that it throws everything into the air such that we can't carry on living in the way which we were. And I'm going to lean on that kind of definition a little bit when I talk about the thinner concept of evil, which I want to put forward. Okay, so current debates on the secular concept of evil have really centered around whether we should eliminate or re-engineer the concept of evil. So this is often put in terms of two rival camps, comes up in Luke Russell's book and also in Todd Calder's Stanford Encyclopedia entry. Two rival camps of evil skepticism versus evil revivalism. So evil skeptics recommend eliminating the concept of evil. Evil skeptics think that the concept of evil is one which has no application in a modern secular society. And evil revivalists recommend re-engineering the concept of evil, retaining it to a certain degree and perhaps sharpening the definition so that it can become useful for a secular age. In both cases, I think it's agreed that there is something fundamentally defective with the concept of evil as it stands, that perhaps it's slightly confused as it stands, or at least that it has metaphysical and some practical and normative effects which are less than ideal. And part of my argument here will be to say that actually the concept is in good standing, but should be given a thin reading in order to understand it in an accurate way. Okay, so as I said, there's a dispute between evil skeptics on the one hand and evil revivalists on the other. And evil skeptics say that we should get rid of the concept of evil, that it's not very useful for our current age. And evil revivalists say that we should use the concept of evil, but maybe sharpen it in a way so that it can be applicable to a contemporary society. Now, the arguments for evil skepticism, I think, can be split into two types. There are descriptive arguments to say that evil is a concept which is not good standing. And then there are normative arguments which say that the concept of evil is not of good standing. And I'll go over these in a bit more detail in a moment. But the descriptive arguments are that evil refers to a supernatural force or entity, and that that's part of what the concept is. It's part of the definition of the term. And secondly, that evil describes an absolutely malicious and spiteful psychological profile. And again, some people think that that is part of the definition of the term. And we'll just talk about what those things say. And then there are normative arguments which say that effectively evil is non-explanatory, that it's effectively just a kind of way of expressing disgust at something, but doesn't really give you any proper full explanation. And then secondly, that evil is counterproductive. So I'll just go over those in a little bit more detail. So the first argument which the evil skeptic gives is to say that evil is supernatural. And because it's supernatural, it doesn't really have a place in modern secular discussion. So the notion of evil as essentially supernatural is arguably rooted in our language and culture. So at least one definition from the Oxford English Dictionary puts evil as the the adjective evil, as profoundly immoral and malevolent, embodying or associated with the forces of the devil. And as a noun, profound wickedness and depravity, especially when regarded as a supernatural force. So the objection there really is to say that if evil is associated with the supernatural, and it's associated with the forces of the devil or associated with a supernatural force, then it really doesn't have a role to play in serious secular discussion. So the claim from the evil skeptic here is that the concept of evil is rooted within an outmoded pre-modern worldview. So this is a worldview where which I'm kind of getting this from Charles Taylor, by the way, this kind of idea about the enchanted world as opposed to the secular world of now. And I think the world was thought of as enchanted to Taylor in the pre-modern worldview. So spirits are part of the furniture of things: good spirits, bad spirits, demons, possessions, sacred places and sacred times, unholy places and unholy times. So it's not just that there is a kind of sense of a good and a bad and of an evil. It's that these forces permeate the world, and they permeate places, they permeate people, and they even permeate times. Certain times can be evil times or good times. On this world, God is undeniable. It's what Wittgenstein calls a hinge. So both metaphysically and morally, the idea is that God simply exists. There isn't a question about God. So as Taylor said, God figures in this world as the dominant spirit, and moreover as the only thing that guarantees that in this awe-inspiring and frightening field of forces, good will triumph. So this is a world of narrative and symbol, not of law and mechanism. Famines, plagues, harvest, storms were actions of agents, demons, saints, sometimes God. And acts of God, like the acts of spirits, angels and demons, were acts of agents with unpredictable narrative style explanations and non-law-like motives. So on this viewpoint, evil is something which has a place within this worldview. That evil is some kind of force in the way that you had these kind of forces within this worldview. Within this worldview, the world was permeated by these spirits and these forces. So on the evil skeptic's view, evil has its place within this worldview. And once you move away from this worldview, as we did through the scientific revolution and through the Enlightenment, then this concept of evil no longer really has any application. It becomes something which really can't get a proper hold on anything in a modern worldview. And we can see the survival of this kind of concept of evil, it's argued, within popular culture as well. You think about things such as The Exorcist, or about something like Darth Vader and the dark side of the Force within popular culture. Okay, so that's one argument against the concept of evil. One argument for saying that we should retire the concept of evil, that we should get rid of it, we should eliminate the concept. And the idea is it simply has no application in a modern worldview. But once you move to a secular age and a world which is understood in terms of mechanisms and in terms of law, then the concept of evil can't get a hold, because the concept of evil is something which is tied to a picture of the world as one in which it's inhabited by forces rather than by laws and mechanisms. Okay, so the second argument is one of psychological implausibility. The idea that not only does evil attach itself to the idea of some form of kind of supernatural force, it also ties itself to the idea of something being 100% evil, that someone has no redeeming characteristics. And this seems as if it's psychologically implausible. So the idea of evil as some kind of wicked and malicious character is expressed in this passage from David Hume in his Inquiries. He talks about a creature absolutely malicious and spiteful. Were there any such in nature? He's obviously skeptical about that, but still he thinks a creature absolutely malicious and spiteful, were there any such in nature, must be worse than indifferent to the images of virtue. All his sentiments must be inverted and directly opposite to those which prevail in the human species. Whatever contributes to the good of mankind as it crosses the constant bent of wishes and desires must produce uneasiness and disprobation. And on the contrary, whatever is the source of disorder and misery in society must, for the same reason, be regarded with pleasure and complacency. So that's someone who's got their motives inverted. It's somebody who is 100% and completely evil. Now, one thing which I think we don't really believe in anymore is this idea of a completely wicked and malicious character. In fact, the idea that kind of character is outmoded is something which I think goes along with Hannah Arendt's thesis of banality of evil. That when we look at people who actually do the worst kinds of things, like Albert Eichmann, then we see somebody who's not completely wicked and malicious in this sense, that they don't have these inverted desires. In some aspects of their life, they might be perfectly agreeable. So they don't have this completely twisted motivation set. And yet, I think if we want a concept of evil, then we can't tie it to this idea of there being a kind of wicked character. So the argument goes from the evil skeptic, if the concept of evil really is tied to this idea of someone who is absolutely and 100% evil without redeeming characteristics, then there is no such person, as Hume says, in nature. So going on now to the normative arguments. So the normative argument, first normative argument against the concept of evil is just to say that it's non-explanatory. So Philip Cole, in his book, The Myth of Evil, says this: if we submit the devil to any detailed examination to understand why he afflicts mankind, humanity, because he's evil, paradoxically, fails spectacularly to explain anything about him and his motivations. So the concern there is it just simply does nothing, the concept of evil. If we want to understand why somebody does what they do, reaching for the concept of evil adds nothing at all to our explanations. It simply labels something which we don't like. That's Cole's thought, that it simply plays no role, and in fact possibly gets in the way of a proper explanation, that in some sense it shut down the explanation. And that leads on to a fourth argument, that it's counterproductive, that it can be used to dehumanize people, that it's used to other people. So if you call someone evil, particularly if you associate it with that kind of character Hume was talking about, or if you associate it with some malicious force, then it can be used very, very easily to other people, and has been used, obviously, to other people. It's used for propaganda purposes, and it's been used to justify war and genocide. I think these are quite serious objections to the concept of evil, because, and it partly comes along with the concept of evil, because it's so extreme, then it wields with it a lot of power, and then it can be used for propaganda purposes. And if you put this together with Philip Cole's other point, that it doesn't do much other than give that evaluative claim, then there is a concern that it's just a concept which can be wielded without any explanatory background, but as a way of othering other people. So here's an example, anyway, in advance of the Iraq War. George Bush said, evil is real and must be opposed. And I think the concept of evil is used, I'm trying to remember, there was something quite recently, I think, where the concept of evil it's put forward, but I can't think what it is off the top of my mind. But yeah, I mean, it is used very, very often in war as encouraging an us versus them mentality. And I think another example is the killing of 2-year-old James Bulger by two 10-year-old children in 1993. Blake Morrison, in his article after James, he also wrote a book on this, As If, I think it was called. He said, Thompson and Venables lost all right to be seen as children or even as human. The word he used about them stopped all arguments. They were evil. And I think there was a headline in the Sun, or maybe it's the Daily Mail, describing them as evil. And that just really stopped the conversation about what kind of response should be had to this murder. Okay, so that's the summary. The summary is this. There are two descriptive arguments against the concept of evil. Firstly, that it's supernatural and therefore unrealistic. Second, that it's psychologically implausible. And then there's two normative arguments. Firstly, that it's non-explanatory, it doesn't do any work. And secondly, that it's counterproductive, that really it's used for propaganda and it's used for demonizing and it's used for othering people. Okay, so I want to now move on to the other side of the debate. So I think there's fairly strong arguments, and I think Philip Cole's probably the one who's given the strongest arguments here. So there's strong arguments, I think, for evil skepticism. But I want to look now at the other side of that debate, which is evil revivalism. And evil revivalists argue the concept of evil should be retained, re-engineered. And partly, this is because it allows us to differentiate extremes of badness from more everyday instances. And as a result, it can carry out a number of functions. So one function which it can play is of epistemic justice. So it allows victims to be able to reach the concepts which can help understand their situation, which provide the proper kind of force for what they've experienced. So if you've experienced something which is absolutely terrible, you want to have recourse to concepts which will allow you to be able to properly process what has happened to you. Otherwise, you might be left with a hermeneutical injustice, to use Miranda's Fricker's claim. Secondly, rehabilitation and reconciliation. So Raymond Gator, in A Common Humanity, writes this: we sometimes need the concept of evil to describe adequately what we are confronted with, and also to characterize adequately our responses to certain actions as their perpetrators, their victims, or the spectators of them. That is to say, in order to properly... So if there has been... So I'm thinking here of something, for example, like the Truth and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa, that in order to properly move beyond the worst kinds of acts, you need it to be the case that everybody can come to terms with the severity of what occurred. And if you don't have recourse to a concept such as evil, then you don't have recourse to a concept which will allow you to understand the severity of what occurred. So that would include both the victims, but also the perpetrators, and also anybody who's involved, either as spectators or as members of society, in order to be able to properly come to terms with what happens and in order to be able to properly move on from what's happened. So that's the second claim about the concept of evil, that it has a function to play, which the concept of bad or wrong is not going to be able to do, that it has a role to play in rehabilitation and reconciliation. Thirdly, in education, it allows for a form of moral education that differentiates the merely bad from those things which would be regarded as beyond the pale. So if you want to make sure that people are properly educated to understand certain acts are not just bad, are not just things which you're going to get punished for, but are things which you really, really should not be doing, that are in some sense beyond the pale, then having a concept of evil will help with that. And then thirdly, attentional resources. That a concept of evil allows for our often dispersed attention to be directed towards moral emergencies when necessary. If we don't have a concept of evil, then we don't have a sense of some things being more essential for our attention because they're so bad. So that would be what the concept of evil would allow us to do. It would allow us to order our reactions and then to focus our attention, some form of moral salience. So the normative function of evil, flag moral emergencies to orient collective attention towards extreme wrongs and to guide responses like punishment, resentment, remorse, forgiveness, reconciliation. And so the point of the concept is some form of moral salience, which would, in some sense, match our reactions to the thing. If the thing is so extreme, then we want a concept which is going to match those reactions both which we should have and reactions which we do have, and reactions which would both be for the victims, for the perpetrators, for society as a whole. So that's a claim about why the concept of evil is necessary and needed. But what is the evil revivalist doing here? The aim is to retain the advantageous functional aspects of the concept. That is, the concept has the functional aspect of moral salience for extreme acts, while jettisoning some of its more suspect metaphysical and rhetorical applications. That is, letting go of those aspects of the concept which the evil skeptic had highlighted as being problematic. So we need a sense in which, firstly, there is a continuity of topic from religious to secular frameworks. So we're talking about the same topic. We're not just changing the subject. But also there's got to be some discontinuity of application. We can't be using the concept in exactly the same way, or else we run up against the evil skeptics' objections. So how should we understand this continuity of topic and discontinuity of application? Well, my suggestion is thick and thin evaluative concepts, and to look at evil as being a thin evaluative concept. So the notion of a thin moral concept can be traced back to Bernard Williams, who thought of them as abstractions from thick moral concepts. So a thick moral concept is one which involves a combination of evaluative and descriptive content. So something like violent, calling someone violent, would involve both evaluative and descriptive content. A thin moral concept, on the other hand, is one which involves only or almost only evaluative concept with no or almost no descriptive content. So typically that would be words like ought, you ought to do this. There doesn't seem to be any descriptive content there in the word ought. In the word good, there doesn't seem to be any descriptive content, or if there is, it's very, very minor amount. The word bad, the word right, the word wrong. Compare that to words such as courageous, words such as corrupt. Those are words which have much more, which are much thicker, that they have aspects of description to them in addition to an evaluative part. So thin concepts, good, bad, right, wrong. Thick concepts, brave, honest, kind, spiteful, cruel. Now, evil, I think, has to be understood as a thin evaluative concept because it has very, very wide coverage, for one thing. So one thing about thin concepts is they have wide coverage. They really do apply to a whole range of different things. And evil seems to be like that. It applies to persons, to intentions, to conduct, and to organizations, institutions, practices, arrangements, programs, agencies, endeavors, and situations, as Singer says. So this ties in with the idea that evil, like good and bad, is a concept which is abstracted from concrete applications. So if evil is devoid of any thick descriptive content, then it can be distinguished from bad or even very bad. It is to say, it is at the extreme of culpable wrongness. So as Nys de Wijze says, we can think of evil, and this kind of ties in a little bit with what Eugene said a couple of weeks ago, and also that quote from Susan Nyman earlier in the talk, that it's a subversion and distortion of normative boundaries. That is to say, evil applies to those things which are at the distorting extreme of our moral evaluations. The idea is that evil is at the extreme, and it's more than just saying it's very, 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 very bad. It's also saying that it's at the extreme in such a way that it starts to distort our whole notion of morality. That would be the claim. So the claim would be to say that it's a thin concept, but it's a thin concept which has a distorting effect on our evaluations. So on this view, there is a continuity of topic when evil is thought of as a thin concept. So understood in this thin way, it is an evaluative concept that functions to categorize events, actions, institutions, etc., as being at the subversive extreme of the moral scale. So that is how it functions. That's its thin content. It's simply an evaluative concept that functions to categorize particular events, but categorizes those events as being at the subversive extreme of the moral scale. But there's also a discontinuity of application or extension when applied to one framework, for example, a medieval religious framework, the kind which I described earlier from Charles Taylor. It picks out different events, actions, etc. as evil than it would do in another framework, for example, a secular framework. So within a medieval religious world, it would pick out, for example, those forces, those supernatural forces, which have a distorting effect on our moral compass. Whereas in a secular framework, they would pick out something other than that. They would pick out something such as, for example, the kind of systematic evil which occurred within Nazi Germany. So on this view, we do not re-engineer the concept of evil itself, because the concept of evil itself is in perfectly good standing as a thin moral concept. We might need to re-engineer the conceptions of it. So returning now to the thick and thin distinction, one way to understand this distinction is via Brent Kyle's expansion view of thick concepts. On this view, a thicker concept, such as violent or maybe cruel, is an evaluative term with some modification. For example, violent might be aggressive behavior in a bad way. Being cruel might be acting towards somebody else in a vicious way. So the claim here is that the concept of evil itself is in good standing. The concept of evil is one which is at the extreme of our evaluative practices. And what we're doing when we're going to be doing conceptual engineering with the concept of evil is thinking about the thicker concepts which will fall under the concept of evil, as well as what falls within the extension of the concept of evil. That's the kind of thing which we should be working on if we're thinking about conceptually engineering the concept of evil. And I think that work is done in that kind of area, that we do kind of work, and a lot of people do work on trying to highlight certain things which might previously have been thought of as just run-of-the-mill events which happen, and try and categorize those things, not as merely bad, but as things which are beyond the pale, things which are evil, which then require particular responses. responses in terms of education, responses in terms of, for example, the law. So one would be domestic violence. That might be one where it's a concept which can be engineered such that it falls under the concept of evil, under the thinner concept of evil, rather than one of just merely within the realm of the bad. So yeah, that's the overall claim here. Is the viewpoint is you don't conceptually engineer the concept of evil itself, because I've argued it's a concept that can fulfill its function well enough, and that function is effectively one of moral salience, and that moral salience is one which then lends itself to attentional resources, it lends itself to education, and it lends itself to thinking about the proper forms of punishment and then also proper forms of reconciliation. So I think the concept of evil itself is in perfectly good standing. But what needs conceptually engineering is thinking about what gets classified as evil. And that is a twofold matter of engineering thicker ethical concepts so that they either incorporate or don't incorporate evil within their thick expansion, and engineering the extension of the concept of evil and its thicker expansions. That is saying what kinds of acts might then fit within the thicker concepts or even within the thin concept of evil. Yeah, so I think of it as a kind of multifaceted concept with a range of functions. And the range of functions, in a way, I think of it as a concept which allows some form of collective attention, and a form of collective attention which then allows for certain acts to be thought of as morally salient, and morally salient in a way which can be shared across a range of different people and shared across a range of different institutions. Okay, that's the end of my talk.